Brittney Hartley, welcome to the show.
So happy to be here.
So we had a really good conversation about 2-3 weeks ago
Mhm.
about the value of truth in the context of nihilism and atheism. We didn't really get to flesh out what those two things were. So to begin, when you hear the word nihilism, what comes to mind?
Yeah, so like the just kind of basic definition that we're working with there is that there's no objective meaning in the universe, which does not mean like people get really bothered by that, like, oh, I have a life of meaning. But what we're saying is that just in being born, there seems to be no objective meaning that the universe is giving you. That doesn't mean you can't create meaning. That doesn't mean that you can't find meaning and purpose, but it just means that this seems to be the situation that we find ourselves in. And there are fantastic philosophers and philosophical content creators who really deal with all of the writers in that space who talk about that space. Really, what I'm doing though when I'm talking about nihilism is less so the definition and the kind of hardcore philosophy around of that, and more that it was an experience for me. And so kind of what I'm hoping to add to the conversation around nihilism, which can become very philosophical and academic, is just talking about what it was like to go through it. Like what was it like as an experience to go through something where you lose your objective grounding. And for me, that caused some level of existential crisis. And so I talk about that more as experience versus just an ism.
What is the experience of nihilism? Now, of course, when we think of nihilism, it is just this descriptive term of this lack of a transcendental context of meaning that we find ourselves in. Is nihilism necessarily a bad thing, or can you find good in it?
Yeah, it's morally neutral in that way. So some people are what we would call optimistic nihilists, where if you say, "Hey, there's no God that seems to be coming to save us," and your life is essentially a blank canvas upon which you can paint. There are a lot of personality types or people that are raised in secularism who find that to be fantastic news. And they're just off and running. Hey, I got this one life. I'm going to live it to the best of my ability. I'm going to be a good person. I have my people. Here's some projects. Here's some things that I want to do. And they seem to have like a really great time in nihilism. That was not my experience with nihilism, and my experience doesn't take away from that. My experience of nihilism was really going through a personal experience of the death of God, which for me included the death of identity, the death of community, the death of truth, at least objective truth or grounded truth, objective morality, having to face death in general. And there was just a lot there as far as anchoring and psychological anchoring that I lost when God died for me. And so my kind of entrance into nihilism, which was much more of the pessimistic side of nihilism, which is I don't understand why I should be a good person. I don't understand how to make a decision. I don't have free will. There seems to be a lot of suffering. Violence seems to be baked in the system. I don't even know if it's ethical to be alive. I don't know up from down. And it was very difficult for me to reorient. And a lot of that comes from that I just wasn't raised secular. I wasn't building some of those skills. I was raised to psychologically build all of that foundation on God, which left me kind of like a newborn baby in an adult body when for me I lost God. And again, that's not the experience for everyone. Some people do really well in nihilism. Some people deconstruct and just feel instant freedom and do great. I just wasn't one of those people. So I tend to, my work is more for people who are really struggling in the more pessimistic side of nihilism, especially struggling with even just the ethics of what it is to be alive.
Mm. People have come to you for help in this area. Do you typically find that the people who need the most help are individuals who come from a religious background or a secular background?
Yeah, most from a religious background. Some of that just could be because of the content I created or resonating with my story. So some of that just may be because those are the kinds of people that I'm reaching. But from what I can tell anecdotally, it seems to be that when I work with secular people or people who were raised outside of religion, they kind of have a kind of emptiness that they're not really sure. Like I just feel like I just life's not really worth living and I feel kind of empty, but it's not really a crisis. There's just a feeling of lack, and they'll come to me just in a kind of curiosity to see if there's anything that I have that could help. Whereas people who come to me for that same space coming from religion, it's much more of a crisis. I lost my faith of God in God yesterday. Today, I don't know how to raise children. I don't know how to make a decision. I don't know what morality is. I don't know how to, like, my religion has this pattern. I'm going to find the truth and then I'm going to pattern my life. But what if there is no truth? How do you pattern your life when everything is just seems to be subjective? That's much more of a crisis. And so I tend to not get secular raised people in that level of crisis, even if we're in the same space, because religious people know what they had and they lost it, whereas secular people sometimes just like, I kind of don't know what I'm missing here.
When people do come to you for help from a religious background, do you find, or more, what are the tools, I should ask, that you mostly prescribe to people?
Yeah, so there's just like a couple of shifts that we have to work with that come from having a religious brain. So one of those I mentioned, that the religious brain, especially with Abrahamic religions, you have a pattern in your brain that you find the truth first, and then you'll know how to pattern your life. And then once you get into this kind of nihilism space where like truth is really obscure and ungrounded, how can you possibly then build a life because you don't know what's true? How could I have goals? How could I set goals and live a life that I want to live, not knowing what the point of this is, like what's true? And so we have to build on different ground than a religious brain is used to, which is building up from the point of view of experience, which doesn't require a lot of truth claims there or truths to build on. And there's other ways too. It's making it much more of an internal process rather than on these external metaphysical anchors. So instead of there being like some kind of objective morality that we can see in the universe, we start looking at something like, what are your core values? What are ways that you in your meat suit connect to something bigger than you, even if it's not supernatural? And we start to build kind of from the inside out rather than from the outside in. And that tends to be shifts that can be like, you can learn it if you've had a religious brain, but may not be intuitive for you if you were grown up with this pattern that like truth and morality and all these things exist outside of you, and then you kind of take it in rather than trying to reorient where it's more of an inner life and from the point of view of experience kind of out.
Do people tend to adopt kind of a tool method, or do they tend to approach a specific um, philosophical field? Like, for example, do they grab like more so this works for me here, this works for me here, or do they go, I'm really interested in, for example, a Camus aspect of absurdism or
Yeah.
a existentialist field?
Yeah, it depends if you come from a high demand religion or if you are kind of high in neuroticism and you need a lot of supports there that the religion was providing, then what you tend to see is trying to cling to a new ism. And so it would be very common if you left something like Mormonism, for example, and really dove headfirst into Buddhism, or you're really going to get your grounding from Stoicism, or you find Camus and you're like, I'm an absurdist now, and like that's my identity. So I feel like earlier on in your religious or in your reconstruction after a religious deconstruction, there can tend to be that clinging aspect because you're just kind of falling in the void trying to grab onto something. And then later on, as you kind of build up your tolerance for things like chaos and the unknown and just not knowing what the hell is going on with anything, when you build up your tolerance for that, that's when you can start being a little bit more picky as far as like, here's some things from absurdism and existentialism and mysticism and Buddhism and Stoicism. And all of these things can be very helpful. I have elements of all of those things in my life that I find to be helpful tools. But at the beginning, there can tend to be that kind of clinging where like, I was Mormon, but I'm a secular Buddhist now, or I was Mormon, but I'm an atheist now, and that's my identity. Like there tends to be a lot of that just as a psychological way to hold on to something when you've lost all of your grounding.
How often do people try to become what, for example, Richard Dawkins would call a cultural Christian, pulling on some specific aspects of a particular religious doctrine, and find themselves back within the doctrine that they left, but observing it in a different way?
I would say for the religious deconstruction people, and again, this is just like anecdotally, I don't think I could give you any data on this. It tends to be that that takes time because there tends to be some pain associated with that experience. And so it's easy for Richard Dawkins to say, I'm a cultural Christian because he has no religious trauma. His Christian family didn't kick him out because he lost his beliefs. Therefore, it's somewhat painful to walk into a cathedral because it has some baggage around it. He sings Christmas carols and just like feels like that's just totally appropriate thing to do. When I sing a Christmas carol, I can sometimes remember what that phrase meant when I was a believer, and my brain gets really busy about all the problematic theology in that word that I just sang. And then, I'm feeling triggers in my body and it's a different experience. So I would say getting to the point where someone would say like, oh, I'm a social Jehovah. Well, you can't really do this with Jehovah's Witnesses. They're pretty rough on their shunning. But like, I'm a cultural whatever. But I'm just gonna use Mormonism because it's the I was raised Mormon, so it's the religion that I understand the most. But it tends to take a long time for someone to say, I'm a cultural Mormon. There's so many things that I do now that are just still very Mormon coded. But I can do it with just like a lot of inner peace and grace, and that just tends to take time and processing because it's usually painful to leave a religion in some ways.
Do people tend to, for the people that you have seen go back to a secular interpretation of a religious tradition, do you tend to find that they gravitate more towards like the ethics, or is it more so I'm interested in the traditions? Like, for example, with Christians, do they are they still willing to participate in Christmas, for example, or is it more so like the ethics or the teachings of Jesus are really
Mm,
interesting, and perhaps I can build my life with value around that? So what do they
yeah.
gravitate more towards?
It's such a good question. It's such an Austin question. Such a good question. Um, that's a compliment. When I say it's an Austin question, like you're getting to something just like really like you keep kind of like going down a level in a way that I really appreciate about your brain. Um, what I tend to see is not an overall pattern where like people are turning to this nuanced Christianity in order to hold on to X. What I find, especially just in the nature of my work, is we find the existential fear, and the existential fear drives them to want to be a nuanced Christian, let's say like a Richard Rohr type Christian, because there's a fear there that's driving that need. And so part of my work is really just getting like, instead of just being driven by the fear subconsciously, let's kind of bring that to our conscious attention and work with it. That, hey, you can absolutely decide that you want to be a secular Christian. Like there's a lot of people I know, friends, content creators that I'm in contact with that call themselves secular Christians or atheist Christians or
Mhm.
nuanced Christians or mystic Christians. Like I love all the flavors of that. Like, that's really interesting to me. And I'm not going to combat ever like their beliefs. It's more so that like, let's just get a little bit more honest about why you're doing this.
Mhm.
Because if you're doing this because you're afraid of death, rather than just forcing yourself to go back to religion and do all this mental gymnastics, let's just maybe sit with death a little bit. Or if it's
Mm.
meaninglessness, or if it's fear of freedom, or you don't want to lose your family, or you're afraid of what the consequences will be for your wife, or you just can't live in a world that doesn't have ultimate justice. I have clients like that. Like they just essentially like refuse to live in a world that's not just. Like it's just too painful. And so I, I don't have an overall thing of like, here's what everyone is doing, but what I can say is that there's existential fears at the root driving the behavior to create the mental gymnastics to stay in the religion that you emotionally want to be a part of.
Many people might say that part of this mental gymnastics is going to be just simple titles, right? So if I, for example, don't believe in God, if atheism is defined as the proposition that a God does not exist, and I affirm that proposition, but then I go ahead and I identify with some form of secular Christianity, the title there is going to be very strange. Am I a secular Christian? Can you be a Christian while being an atheist? Do you find people that struggle with the identity part of it, with just the title?
Oh yeah, of like what to call yourself.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. I would say that people really struggle. Sometimes people will come to me and ask for help for like what am I, especially if they're in a place where they feel like they need to have an identity. And usually the work there is not me helping them finding the right word for what they want to call themselves. It's really maybe going down a level and saying, why do you so badly need an ism to describe yourself?
Mm.
Why can't you just be Austin? Like what's wrong with
Hmm.
that? And usually then I'll find an existential fear in there of like, but if I don't call myself a Christian, then X. Okay, now there's something there driving this, and that's where we then go to work with it. So titles are like the words in this space are really tricky. Even for me, there was one year where I spent the entire year where the question that was driving me that year is what do I want to do with the God word as someone who works in this space? How do I do this ethically for myself, but in ways that connect me to other people? And I spent the whole year thinking about it. So the words are a problem, but I feel like there's an even, layer underneath that, which is why are you needing to use the right word, or why are you needing to call yourself a Christian? And that can usually be a place where we need to do a lot of inner work. And then you can usually find a title that is not perfect, but at least is good enough for you to interact in the world.
God, I really want to stay in this nihilism spot, but the God word is such a fascinating
I
area
spent
for
it
me.
like it was a whole year where it's like I just thought about how to use the God word, and like it's not an easy question.
At
It's a
all.
question that for sure took up a year's worth of time without me being bored with it.
Yeah, so we're going into this. We're going to come
Okay.
back to the nihilism,
Okay.
but this God word, people typically have their own frame of reference when they hear the term and they go, God, you know, white Jesus, blue eyes, blonde hair, apple pie, stuff like that. Or they go, um, they can identify with like Shiva, Zeus. They can go towards Yahweh. They can go towards Allah or the actual historical Jesus that we probably should be referencing with the word Jesus, not the, you know,
Mm.
blonde hair, apple pie type of Jesus. But
I
when
wish I
you
wish in America we had apple pie Jesus. We have like, we have gun Jesus, which is worse than apple pie Jesus.
Yeah, my church growing up had still has actually. I went back there a few weeks ago. Has white Jesus on the wall. I'm like, I don't know who this guy
Mm.
is. But when you hear the word God, people have their own interpretations of the word, and it's very hard to understand what's going on. Gordon Kaufman, I think, gives me my favorite interpretation. It's like God is the ultimate limit which transcends, and we apply or the ultimate transcendent limit which we apply personal language to, and that can be
Mm.
and
Mhm.
it can incorporate many different traditions, and it just kind of validates all the traditions as like, yeah, you're talking about God, whatever it is, you're just identifying it with God. When you hear
Mm.
the word God, what comes to mind?
Yeah, it's like you said, like God, there's 1,000 different ways that people mean that word. And so the reason that I took a year to think about it is like if I'm creating content and I'm working with clients, I want to be able to meet this word without betraying myself because I don't want to be a hypocrite. I don't, but I also don't want to just say, there's no concepts of God that I can relate to because that doesn't seem fair either. There are many concepts of God that I'm open to that are on the table for me. There are just some concepts of God that I'm highly skeptical on. So I was really debating all this in my head. And so for me, the way that I made peace with this word is I kind of differentiate more the emotional aspect of what people are calling God from the arena of truth claims. So if someone walks into a cathedral and says, I feel God here, what I think that is at root level is they're experiencing a feeling. and they're using a math sound called God to describe what they're feeling as a human. And I have absolutely zero trouble. Like, it requires no trigger or mental gymnastics for me as an atheist to say, I feel God here too. Absolutely. Like, I have no problem saying I feel God here too. Now, if you say God is X and he thinks X and this is his special book and God hates gay people and, whatever. Okay, like, that is, we've left the realm of using this word to describe something human that we can both relate to. We've left that world, and now we're in the world of metaphysics. And when we're in the world of ontology or metaphysics or epistemology, there are different tools then for that space. And that's where I'm going to say, like, hey, these are now truth claims. And historically, when we talk about humans and our batting average as far as truth claims related to God and metaphysics, we're very bad at this game, which means we should be highly skeptical of the truth claims around the God word in that space. And so I kind of almost have this split experience where if I'm with the mystics, where they're talking about the experience of what people have called God, I have no problem with this God word. I'm saying it, I'm hearing it, we're all about it, all that's fine to me. And then I'll go to more, to more of a space where we're talking about these, truth claims about God. That's a space where, like, I just become like a Christopher Hitchens, and I'm just very skeptical, and I want to, like, really pin down how you think you know this. And anyway, and being a Mormon is really helpful for that skeptical space. So for the record, Mormons, more than any other religion in America, when they deconstruct, tend towards atheism, more than other religions. And one of the reasons for that, there's multiple reasons for that. One is that it's a young religion, and so you can see how a man becomes a prophet. You can see how things become scripture. It makes you very then skeptical of other scripture, and other prophets and other claims. But really, something that really makes Mormons into atheists is that I know what it's like to feel something and then believe that the truth claim around that thing is true. So because I feel this when I'm singing a hymn, therefore the historical truth claims about the Book of Mormon are true. I remember making that connection, which makes me then, and because we can fairly reasonably disprove that, it makes me then skeptical that when a human says, I feel this, therefore X about ultimate reality, we should be very skeptical of that jump. So that's kind of how I'm making peace with the God word. I really differentiate it from the experience of what people have called God to I feel X, therefore, or I feel this thing, therefore X about ultimate reality, which I think that's the game where I think we should have a lot more skepticism because we're historically bad at that game.
When people come to you for help with nihilism, do they have problems kind of getting back to using the word God? I'm not saying like going into like a traditional adopting ethics, but like just using the word, even in a non-metaphysical sense, like John Bishop identified God as love, and you get Gordon Kaufman, who's going to identify God as the ultimate mystery, or Mark Johnston is going to say that God is the outpouring of existence into itself. Do people have problems using the word after they deconstruct it?
Yeah, I would say this is one where the people born atheists, in the sense raised atheist, raised secular, I think actually have a harder time than those in religion. Because in religion, like as a Mormon, you probably had some experiences of awe. Like we sing together, we have service projects for each other, we're serving each other all the time, we learn and we speak and we teach to each other. There's so many moments that we curate for transcendent experience, and so you probably felt that at some time during your time in religion or spirituality in some form. And so when really then the project there is, how do we separate what is experience and human from the monopoly that the religion put over those experiences? And we just have to do some work separating that out. And that to me is actually easier than a secular person who sometimes just needs 5 grams of mushrooms to even just understand what the hell we're talking about when we're talking about spirituality and transcendent experience. So I actually, like, if I had to convince someone who wasn't feeling particularly drawn to spirituality to consider spiritual the spiritual world, I would rather take the one who is born in religion and have to
Hmm.
just deal with some separating some things out than the person who really has had maybe no experience in the space at all and doesn't even really know what I'm talking about when I talk about when people are talking about spirituality.
Do you think that people should have that experience? I feel like many people, for example, I know that Sam Harris said something like, who's one of like the most well-known members of the new atheist movement, was like, thought that people should have these psychedelic spiritual experiences, but some people might say that referring that as a spiritual experience might not be the right word, and maybe we shouldn't use that word at all to discuss the manifestation of a sensation given by, drugs, for a lack of a better word. What would you
Yeah.
say for, I think, because I use that word, I think that's how they would use it.
Yeah.
What do you think we should be using these experiences as? Should they be called spiritual, or
Yeah.
should they just be called psychological?
Yeah. And Sam Harris, I think even just recently, I think just yesterday, he was talking to Alex O'Connor about this. They were doing another segment on religion for atheists, where like we're having a really hard time with what word to use here. And Sam Harris wrestled a long time and kind of find himself begrudgingly using the word spirituality, because otherwise the word that we're using is uh peak experiences that are different states of consciousness at the level of the brain. And that's just a really long word.
Yeah.
Versus, and spirituality, it's not even just the experience. Like there's a whole umbrella of things that are contained under the word spirituality. So things like rituals, we have a lot of science behind things like rituals and community and love and wisdom traditions and states of transcendence and inner world work and working with your subconscious and supporting a conversation between your conscious and subconscious mind. All of that we can put under the umbrella of spirituality. It's begrudgingly because you have this word spirit in there, and I'm not about that life, and that word doesn't really carry a lot for me anymore. But we don't have a secular word that means all the same things that spirituality does, just without the connotations around soul or spirit. And so there's just we just don't have a word. And I ask this to secular people all the time, and other people who are spiritual atheists like me, is like, what words are you guys using? Because it's rough. And so what you end up getting is, even just the word that I said, spiritual atheist, what we end up getting in this space is a lot of dual words, where we say like, it's this, but I'm going to put this boundary on it. Like it's spirituality, but I'm going to add atheism to it, so that that we're not going to go off too far into the weeds here. And so you get a lot of these like dual terms. I'm a rational mystic. I'm a, you get these kind of sandwich terms, because we don't have a word for what, we can maybe use transcendent. We could maybe use connection, but it just doesn't have all the juicy stuff in it that spirituality does. So the language is a problem in this space. I tend to be more of the camp wanting to reclaim these words, because I think it does secularism a disservice when religion has a monopoly over these words. There's a study that shows that 2/3 of atheists who have a large mushroom dose, they don't go back to religion, but they don't self-identify as atheists after that experience. And we're talking about heroes doses, so pretty large doses, where they just no longer will call themselves an atheist after that experience. They don't know what to call themselves. They just say, I'm not really an atheist anymore, because I've had this really powerful experience that's really changed me in these fundamental ways. So the language is tough. I do think we should reclaim these words, even though they have baggage. Otherwise, if the only people talking about these kinds of experiences are religion, then your only option is to go to religion to try to make sense of these experiences. And I think that does all of us a disservice.
How much do you think the imagination plays a role in how we navigate the world in a spiritual sense, for lack of better words? We tend to think of humans, at least the ancient Greek philosophers and a lot of the modern philosophers, thought that humans were rational beings, and that was just the highest good. We should always be rational. And this took a large part in the new atheist movement. Are humans only rational, or are we also imaginative? creative beings.
Yeah, I definitely tend towards, that we are emotional and imaginal being far more than we're rational beings. And I think that there's a lot of evidence to show that. So I'm very skeptical of any man who tells me that they're operating under pure rationality, which I get a lot of those types in my comment section. I really do feel like is like they're operating around a really intense illusion that because this is the way that they think and they haven't really dug into why that way, they just assume that they're purely rational. And I think that when you get into this deeper layer of your subconscious and your existential fears and your core values and your traumas and your inner child and your shadow, when you dig into that space, you realize like what you've called rationality is just what you're doing afterwards to describe emotionally what's really driving you. So I'm much more in that space, but the question that comes up, and I would love to ask you this question, or maybe I
Sure.
did in our last podcast. I might have asked you this, but I'm really interested in this question lately. Is there seems to be this split in the secular community between how much imagination, specifically when we get into magical thinking, is helpful and hurtful for humanity. And there's a scale, and I think on one scale is like Richard Dawkins, which is like, let's just throw all of this away. Like it's not true. Like there's so many clips of someone, I think it was Jordan Peterson, asking him like, hey, have you ever like wrestled with dragons? And of course Jordan Peterson is doing
Yeah.
this in this like very symbolic archetypal hero's journey
Jungian,
kind
yeah.
of way. And Richard Dawkins is literally like, dragons aren't real, therefore no, what the hell are you talking about? You know what I mean? And like he wouldn't even play in that space. Like he gave nothing to Jordan Peterson in that question. And then you have kind of the other side, which I think is probably best embodied not by Sam Harris but by Stephen Fry, who is an atheist and very critical of religion, but is a theatrical, story-driven person, and he considers himself an empiricist more than a rationalist, which is that he loves kind of human imagination and magical thinking and rituals as something we experience. And so one of the examples he uses is that he thinks that the president of the United States should once a week walk up to a statue of George Washington and explain to George Washington what you did as a president in this country that week. Now, is George Washington listening or real? Is this capital R real or capital T true? No. But the ritual of it, the playing in it, is something valuable to him. And he thinks that lots of magical thinking is in this way, that maybe he wouldn't have said this, but other people say this, like maybe astrology isn't capital R real, but it gives us a liturgical calendar for us to explore various aspects of our psyche. Therefore, it's still, you can put it in a good category. And it's interesting talking to more secular minded people about all the tiny ways that humans are superstitious. And there was a really viral Reddit thread that asked, what's a little superstition that you do? And it'll be like, it went really viral. And I read through them, and it was just so apparent that humans are still kind of silly and superstitious, even when they know that it is. Like someone said, when I pull into a parking lot, I say a prayer to St. Anthony to help me find a spot, and then a spot opens up, and it's probably not real, but I do it anyway. And so I don't think the question is, are we imaginative? Do we do magical thinking? Are we superstitious by nature? Are we driven by something other than rationality? I think we can fairly confidently say that we're not rational robots there. I think the real question is how much of this is good and how much of this has a negative effect, because the more that we deal in this magical thinking space, the less we're able to focus on the actual, probably systemic problem that we should be addressing. So anyway, do you have thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think it would be really interesting to have the president kind of go up to the statue of George Washington, because I think in a way what you're doing is embracing and confronting the spirit of the American foundation. It may just be like the statue, this physical material statue. That's not what you're facing. You're facing I have to say spirit because I don't have a better word for it. But
See, you did
yeah,
it.
yeah, it is. I think what you're doing is you are confronting the spirit of that which laid the foundation that you're standing on.
Mhm.
And what would you do if Washington was standing right in front of you? And it's not, you have to keep that in mind. I think that's what a lot of people do with God too. You have this mystery, then you build these characteristics, which I don't want to say build because they're really like given. They're kind of coming from a framework that they're brought up within. And you're facing that which laid your foundation. Now, of course, I don't think that what the president would be doing is looking up to God. But you're still looking up to an authoritative figure that laid the foundation of what you stand on. I think this raises a really good question about the making of worlds. I'm really interested in the idea of world making, where we aren't just like in one world, but we have symbols for each world. Some people might say that physics, for example, is just the foundation of the universe and that is our world. But you can't take the world, the symbols of physics, and apply them to the world of art and get the same meaning. You can't do it with dance. They're different symbols. And I think that there's something kind of magical in a way of creating and embracing different worlds within one physical material world and kind of just like playing with mouth sounds to describe each part of the world that we embrace. But given that the way that we make a world does not mean that's the way that the world is, and in a way, that is magical in itself. We're all
Yeah.
living. I have like my frame of reference. You have yours. We might be saying the same words. We might have completely different meanings, and all we can really say is, okay. All we can really say is like you have yours, I have mine. Maybe we agree on some, maybe we don't. In a way, I think even that is imaginative at its best, and we just like get rid of that. Like, no, we created the way that we see the world, and like you think that that's just like that's purely rational. I think
Mm,
it's completely the complete
yeah.
opposite. Do you have any thoughts there?
Oh, I have a lot of thoughts there. First, I want to go with this idea that sometimes I get accused that like by being as skeptical as I am, because I'm pretty harsh on what I consider nonsense in this space. That's just like
Sure.
my jam. Um, and and people will accuse me that like I just sit around and like read scientific journals and I've lost all the magic. And to me, like even though for me there's aspects of God that died for me that I just can't believe anymore. In no way did that end magic for me. Because what do you mean that my brain projected out these forms almost of idealism, and that by working with that projection I was able to become a more compassionate person, or have a conversation, a prayer in my own brain where I'm talking to different aspects of my brain. Like, that's magical. Like,
Mhm.
what is that if not like magical? You know what I mean? And it brings up the question that, like, if that's what we're doing, could we actually work with this concept of God while rationally knowing that the God is not there? Or is that
Mhm.
too difficult for us to do as a society? And really, only individuals and certain kinds of individuals can do that because for example, my doctorate professor, who I'm going to meet with right after this, he is one of the leaders of open and relational theology. And he really has this strong concept of God is love. And I don't believe in the God that he believes in. But what I would 100% agree on is that him working every day with the concept of God is love and how do I order my life according to love and act according to love in this person created the most loving person I've ever met. Like if I had to choose between a man or the bear, like I could choose him. Like it created one of the most beautiful people I've ever been able to meet. And so even though his God isn't capital R real in a way that I can sense, uh it created a very beautiful person in the process of him working with that ideal. And so could we actually do something like that? But I don't like I think individuals can, but like could we create a community or a religious or something around that? I think what happens is, in order to like put in resources and time and money for it to be something like a religion or a community, that you actually have to actually believe. Otherwise, you just get to be that person in a more traditional kind of church, but you're out there doing yeah, God isn't really real, but I'm working with this in this way. I
Mhm.
just don't think that everybody can do that.
I've been really interested in. I emailed you the other day, and I sent you like some book recommendations that I've been really enjoying by Gordon
Mm,
Kaufman, and he has just been changing how I think about everything. He's a part of this imaginative construction theology, and many people would call him an atheist. He's very clear. He does not think that any God that we believe in is God. He thinks that they're all idols. He does not believe in life after death, but he thinks that the human condition is one of finitude. And when we recognize this, what we realize is that it's all a mystery. And what we do in our daily life, when I speak to you, for example, there's a model of transcendence there that we don't even recognize. I'm looking at you and I see you and I can hear your words, but there's a you that I will never have access to. There's a you that's somewhere, the observer in your mind, that only you can recognize. So I have to just say that I know Brittany, right? But there's a
mhm,
way that I don't. There's something transcending, and I can really
mm,
appreciate that transcendence. And what he thinks about this is that we should be doing the same thing with God. Like, yeah, there's this ultimate mystery. That's what it is. It's creative, it's mystery, but it's something that we can never know. Like we can't, in the same way that I can never know you. That there's like
mm,
this confrontation that I see you, but there's something beyond it. What do you
mm.
take with that approach to theology?
Yeah. So I have no issues with I've heard lines of reasoning towards that direction in multiple paths. So there's deism. Like you can even hear this in like Rainn Wilson and how he talks about God, sometimes how mystics talk about God. Or sometimes like I'll hear it from Pete Holmes, is kind of trying to popularize this kind of God word that we wrap around the mystery, and I think he's bringing that into more popularity. And I'm open to all of those. Like none of those really bother me. Those conceptions of God. If you want to call God in this Jordan Peterson way, like it's just your highest core value. I mean, there's lots of concepts like that where God is just the word that we're wrapping around some kind of transcendent that is somewhat mysterious, but we seem to be interacting with in some way. I don't have issues with that. That absolutely could be true as far as what's happening. The thing that I'm very sensitive to getting smuggled in is that God is good. Like, okay, like now it's not just like source or the seed of being or mystery or transcendent. Now you're putting a moral quality to it that
Mhm,
God is good. And that's where I'm going to have issues because I just am more of the camp that even just looking at animal suffering and how long it took us in evolution and how much bloodshed and violence and animals eating each other alive for no real salvific reason in order for you and I to just even have a conversation with the God word. I think it brings up issues to say God is good or that this is ethical, because it may be that given the nature of suffering baked into reality that we're a suffering dog, that the most moral thing to do would be to put the dog down. So I don't think I think you can go that direction. There's many directions that I explore in that theological space. The one that I'm most familiar with is open and relational theology, where the future is open, and God is relational and in connection with the universe. Um, but I just don't think you can smuggle in with that God is good. And that's the sneaky thing that people tend to do, is
mhm,
because rationally they'll play in this space of mystery, but then emotionally they'll still drag in there God is good in ways that
mm,
I think are unfair.
mhm. It seems like we're heading directly into the atheism space, and I certainly want to go there. I have one more question about nihilism before we get into the atheism. James Tartaglia I had on my podcast a few weeks ago, an incredible philosopher who wrote the book Philosophy of a Meaningless Life, and he addresses nihilism, the people identify as the problem of nihilism. And he says that nihilism does not have to be a problem because the idea of life needing meaning is a religious dogma that can be rejected. And through this, we can probably get to a world which many people don't struggle with nihilism. Do you think this is possible?
No. And I this is one, like sometimes I say I think this person is wrong, and I'm fairly confident. This is more of a hesitant no. Like I see his arguments, and I've read some of his work, and there's even more of like a there's a popular book called The Sunny Nihilist that goes in this direction, but is less academic, which just talks about like instead of building up meaning, we just collapse the need for meaning, and then the absurd problem is solved because we no longer have this need for meaning, and this is just something that comes, to us from religion. And I just feel a lot more evidence. I feel like there's a lot more evidence towards the idea that our brains are meaning makers, and that's how they operate. And so to say we're just going to live without meaning is like saying I'm going to operate by photosynthesis now. It's like ideally, maybe, but just don't think that that's what we are. I see the idea of it. I just don't think that that's the way that human nature operates as a whole. And I see that our brain is much more attuned towards creating meaning and creating stories and filtering according to meaning, that it's going to be hard to just solve the problem by collapsing the need. And so I'm much more in the camp of, especially if you have some level of suffering in your life, I'm much more in, like, we can certainly reduce that. Some of the demand that everything be meaningful, we can reduce some of that, but I'm much more in the camp of building up meaning to address that problem, because I feel like that latches onto human nature better, and how our brains operate better. I think religions help us with meaning making, not because it's just religious indoctrination, but because we created it to, because we're meaning makers. So there's like a chicken and an egg there, where like he's pointing to religion and I'm saying, no, we created religion because our brains are meaning makers by nature. That's the driver here. Religion is just the product of what is actually driving the need to even create religions in the first place. So I disagree there, but it's a hesitant no. Like, he's like brilliant in his work in his own field. It's just like that's just not mapping onto how I'm working with people on the ground. It doesn't seem to be like, even in my space, something like absurdism, which you've talked about, and I think you have some similar critiques. I know a lot of people who like find absurdism and stay there for a couple years, and then find that it's lacking in some way, right? Like just the stance of like, I'm gonna rebel, or just the stance that life doesn't have to be meaningful. I don't see that people are living long-term lives of thriving through these philosophies. I see them lacking in ways that are just not addressing the whole of what it is to be human. That's maybe just my experience.
No, I would definitely agree with you. I think that absurdism does lack, and I think that it's not meant to be. Maybe Camus did intend for it to be a permanent system of, I would probably identify as coping, as Tartaglia does in chapter 2 of his book, coping mechanisms. And I think he's right there. I think we can definitely agree on that front. Do you think that nihilism, when people address atheism, that nihilism is necessarily entailed?
No, because you can be an atheist and have all kinds of anchored beliefs that help you function that are just not related to a theistic God. So atheism and nihilism, I don't think are interchangeable terms there. Because I know a lot of atheists who, for example, have some anchors from secular humanism, that the world is going to tend towards justice, or that we could create XYZ, and that here are my, instead of 10 commandments, here are my 10 commitments, and here's my, and there's just certain beliefs in there that are psychologically anchoring, that really wouldn't put you into a place of like a nihilistic void, but you would still absolutely be an atheist. So I don't think that those two terms are interchangeable. I do think there are times when you're deconstructing from religion and go towards atheism, that there's going to be some gaps there, because you just don't have any way of orienting where you can tend towards nihilism. But I don't think that atheism by necessity is nihilistic.
There's a lot of different terms and definitions for atheism, and I don't think that we have to hash them all out here, as it's a very dense philosophical field.
Yeah,
So I'm
I
just
have
going to
questions
ask.
for you. Yeah, I have questions for you about that.
Yeah, it's I've been lucky. My supervisor for one of my independent studies, his name is Bruce Milam, and his whole field is defining atheism. So I have been so
Mm,
lucky to just be like kind of thrown into that.
mm.
Um, so just to clarify for those who are listening, when we say the word atheism, what are we going to be referring to?
So for me, and this is just there's even to answer your question, I have to just like recognize that the language in this space seems to be changing. And
Yeah.
so when I was studying philosophy and theology 20 years ago and was learning about what atheism is, it was just this thing that says that there's a lack of belief in a theistic God. Like, do you believe in a theistic God? If your answer is no, then you're an atheist. It doesn't say anything else. It makes no positive claims on ultimate reality. You could still believe in the soul or an afterlife or all kinds of things. You just are unconvinced of a theistic God. And then I think something happened, and I do think that Christianity really drove the was threatened and then kind of drove the change there, where they started to talk about atheism as a belief system, that atheists are just like Christians. They just believe that the universe came from nothing, right? Like all these straw men that you get from the Christian
Hmm.
side of things. And it started to be, and then with the new atheist, at least publishing movement, you know, whether you could call it a unique thing is up for debate, but it was at least a publishing phenomenon. It became like I'm an atheist and I know that there's no God, or I'm skeptical to all forms of spirituality or new age spirituality or woo woo, whatever. Or I'm an atheist and it's my identity, and it essentially means I'm this kind of person, this kind of annoying person who has these kinds of beliefs. And it just in my lifetime, it just feels like this word changed a lot. And so when I use it, I'm still using it in the way that I was taught, which was it's just a lack of belief in a theistic God. So I would be an atheist, but not an adeist, for example. Like I'm still very open to maybe deistic forms of God, but this Abrahamic God, if you ask me, do you believe? Are you acting as if you know this is true? My answer is no. I'm very skeptical to this Abrahamic theistic form of God.
Hmm.
But I'm struggle with this word because, again, like I'm so open to panpsychism and deism and forms of spirituality and mysticism. I've had a mystic teacher for over 20 years now. There's so much there that I'm exploring. And atheism seems to now mean to people that I can't play in any of those spaces. And that wasn't the case, I felt like 20 years ago. It
Hmm.
felt like you were, you know, you were fairly free to explore in those spaces. And now it feels like atheism means you're against all of that. And so I don't quite know what to do with that word. I know Alex O'Connor has recently made a shift away from calling himself an atheist, and he's kind of leaning towards calling himself an agnostic. And I have problems with that emotionally because, like, in my experience, so many people who are agnostic because they just really don't care fundamentally about some of these questions. And I care so much.
Hmm.
Like so
Hmm.
much of my life is thinking about these questions that like emotionally I don't want to be put in the camp of people who just like they're just not driven by these questions because I care so much.
Hmm.
So I'm obviously torn over this word, like the other words that we've used in this podcast, but I still tend towards calling myself an atheist just to kind of signal to people that what I'm doing as far as spirituality and meaning and purpose is just not going to entail this heavy dependence on special books and Abrahamic gods. But I understand that this word is changing in ways that have even just happened in my lifetime, and I don't quite know what
Hmm.
to do with that yet. What do you have much more experience in academically studying this word right now? So what do you
Hmm.
think?
Well, one, I want to say that I agree that I care so much about this word. I care so much about this field. I have a good friend and old professor, Sebastian Purcell, who teaches Aztec philosophy. He's an Aristotelian
Mm,
philosopher. And so him and I were talking about it, and he goes, I was like, well, what do you think is going on? He goes, I don't care. And I was like, and I was like, but you're, he was like, well, tell me why I should care. And I said, well, you're an Aristotelian. If God is real under this interpretation, God is the first principle. And if you are a philosopher, Aristotle defined philosophy as like the study of first principles. Therefore, you should care about God. And he was like, yeah, but I'm a modalist, and it just didn't get further. I was very disappointed. But I think I got a point in there somewhere. But I am very interested in this word because of its developmental history, right? Socrates in his trial is called an atheist, and like very
Mhm,
clearly, Socrates is not an atheist.
mhm.
Um, Going into deism, Spinoza was called an atheist and
Yeah.
excommunicated. He is very
Mhm.
clearly arguing for a conception of God.
Yeah. I have
So
no
this
issue
word,
like, Spinoza's God is not offensive to me. Like, if
yeah,
that's what people meant by God, I probably wouldn't fully call myself an atheist, you know? He's got a
yeah.
whole different thing going on with his God.
hmm Yeah, it's very interesting because there are so many different conceptions that people typically, and this is what I was saying earlier with the frame of reference, you hear the word God and you go, oh, well, Jesus, and we talked about this on your podcast where when I first deconstructed from Christianity, I was like, oh, I'm an atheist because Christianity is not true. And now I look back, I'm like, well, that's just not how that works. There's so many different aspects and conceptions of God that you should be looking at. So what I tend to do is to, and this is much more recent because of the work of Gordon Kaufman, of trying to just give a definition of God that just
Mhm.
overviews every tradition, right?
Mm.
And to say something like God is the symbol which directs a society towards a higher mode of living, and I am an atheist if I just don't use that symbol. That's kind of where
Mm.
I am now. So simply, if I just say I don't use that symbol to direct my life, and then
Mm.
Durkheim would probably say something like, "Yeah, well, you still have sacredness in your
Yeah.
in your values." And Jordan Peterson would come and go, "Well,
I
you
was just gonna
still."
say, like, that's a Jordan Peterson move.
It is, but in a way it works because I think what Peterson's doing is just giving a symbol, right? And I can just say, "Cool,
Mm.
yeah, I don't use that symbol." That's it.
Mm.
So I
Mhm.
I, I think that atheism is just saying, I have no problem with you using that word. I don't use it for myself. Even if
Mhm.
there is
Mhm. Even if
this
there is
foundation,
transcendent, yeah,
yeah, even if there
or
is, like,
grounded
that's
being or
great.
whatever.
Yeah,
Mhm.
whatever it may be, that's great. I don't use that word. And this is not to say that people, this is not to say, to make this clear, that if God, this being came down, that I wouldn't call it God. I probably would.
Mm.
But based on my evidence that I have now, I have no reason to use that word. And I think that word, not using that word, is what makes me an atheist. Do you have any thoughts there?
Yeah, no, I like that. I like that because I think part of the problems with this word is like to say you're an atheist, you have to define God, and then you also have to define like, are you going to be using theism as the thing that you're rejecting, or are we using theism in a way like it almost feels like with this question, theism itself is then changing because we call what Jordan Peterson is doing or this ground of being or, whatever conceptions of God, are we calling that theism too? And it's like,
hmm
well, I feel like historically, maybe not, but in our current conversation where atheism is changing, it almost feels like theism is now changing too, because
Yeah.
nobody seems to be differentiating anymore between like deism and theism or theism between panpsychism. It's more just like it almost feels like atheism is now just being attached to materialism. And anyway, all these words are changing in ways that I think about a lot, and is really hard to navigate because even how I use these terms seems to be not mapping onto how others are using these terms, which just makes it hard for everyone.
Yeah, I agree. It certainly does. And I think there's something interesting too to say something like that God is the symbol that orients, right? Because then if we just look at the Bible, just as an example, we can see the Bible being a structure and explanation of the consciousness which or the consciousness of the society developing across time by using this
Mm,
symbol to orient themselves. I can go, yeah, that's God for
mm,
them, but I'm not going to use that
mm,
word to describe that God.
mm,
I think it does make the field very hard to navigate, but I think it makes it much more inclusive. And I say that
mm,
because if we just say that, like, in the West, an atheist just like doesn't believe in God, but the idea of God is just like this Abrahamic. I think that's very limited.
Yeah.
I think
Yeah,
it's
it's just
very
white,
limited.
like white Jesus. My favorite, this
Yeah.
goes to my favorite definition of religion, because religion is notoriously almost impossible to define in a way
Hmm.
that actually applies to all religions across the board, because many
Yeah.
religions are non-theistic or, non-supernatural. And so how do you even define this word, even especially in societies that haven't had a kind of separation between science and religion and culture? And it's just like there are mountains of books of how to even define the word religion. And what you just said there kind of reminds me of my favorite definition of religion that I found, which is from Mircea Eliade. And he says, just religion is how you orient yourself in the universe. And everybody does have to do that, because you're kind of dropped here and have to make decisions, and you just start kind of orienting. And what that what that speaks to, and kind of what you said, is that like there is an openness as far as human nature, where what we're really asking when you're meeting someone new and you're curious about them is, rather than like, are you an atheist, do you believe in God, I feel like the root question there is like, hey, you're a human flying on this space rock like me. How are you orienting with all of this? what
Hmm.
what
Hmm.
what orients you? How do you move about the world, and I
Hmm.
feel like that's really the root question that we're asking, that everybody does do. And if you're a Christian, then okay, I kind of can get a sense of how you orient your life. I know the
Hmm.
rituals and the people and the values and the projections and the heroes and the stories, and I can get a sense of that. And I think that's one of the reasons that people really distrust the morality of atheists, because people don't know, like, I know how I morally orient. If you're not that, how do I know that you are morally oriented in some way? Which
Hmm.
is why it's so lacking to just say I'm an atheist. You should be able to say something like, I get my morals from Stoicism, and you can trust it because these are my 4 values, and this is how I orient my life. And so like really, that I feel like that's the root question of what's really going on here, is we're curious or want to connect to other humans and see how they're orienting too, because everybody does seem to have to do that.
Hmm. Now, you and I both identify as an atheist. I'm very loose with that word currently, as we've talked about last time on your podcast. What made you lean towards atheism?
Yeah. It it was a journey. There's a lot there. So in theology school, I'll kind of have to go back there. I was not one of those people who was just exploring religion because I'm curious, but I wasn't a believer. Like, I was really in it. I really did believe. I was orienting, for lack of a better word, my life around this. And so, when I lost my faith in God, the process by which that happened was really getting good at being able to predict what kinds of individuals and what kinds of societies would create, what kind of God. And it happens slowly. You're just studying the Bible and you see that the society changes in this way, and then the doctrine changes in this way, and then society changes in that way, and then the theology goes in that direction. And then after a while, like, you just start to see all the patterns of, oh, when a society is like, just give me a society, tell me the hierarchy, tell me how dependent it is on agriculture, tell me about the flooding, tell me, just tell me how it functions. And you can actually, just without knowing what that society is, I could write down, this is the version of God that they'll come up with. And then you'll be right. And that was like really weird for me. And then we started to work on that, more in the cognitive science of religion, of an individual, that if you're an individual and you have these characteristics and these are your core values, then this is the way that you're going to read Jesus. And this is the way, and if you have this core value, this is the way that you're going to read Jesus. And they're two really different Jesuses. And in this process of really exploring God on a societal level and on an individual level, the thing that I got really good at, that, if I may say so, makes me good at my job when I'm working one-on-one with people, is really getting to see deep down the characteristics of the society or the person that is causing them to believe in the God that they do. and working in that deeper space. And for me, that was just really devastating to the idea that God is the one creating us in this Christian, Genesis kind of way. And it became more and more clear in theology school to me that this God project was an entirely human idea. Now, this didn't mean that I wanted to throw it away. People will ask me, like, "You're an atheist now. Do you regret going to theology school?" And my answer to that is no, because to me, religion has been the best place to learn about human nature, like the absolute best place to learn about what we are as humans. I don't regret any of that. And so I really love, still to this day, like, I study religion more than any religious person that I know. And sometimes I laugh because sometimes in my comment section it'll be like, "You've never read the Bible," and it's like, the amount of times I've read the Bible more than you, like, would shock you, a religious person, So I find it to be the most interesting place to learn about human nature. But it just became apparent to me that this God project seemed to be much more of a human project than something really metaphysical that I could put my finger on. And that was a loss of faith for me. I didn't want that to happen. I had no incentive for that to happen. At the time, it actually really fucked up my life. And I was able to kind of reorient around that. So for me, just the reason that I landed on spiritual atheist is the spiritual just wants to signal to you that I'm open to so many things about what it means to live a good life as a human. And like a lot of that is going to be in spiritual spaces or wisdom housed in religion. And I want to really lean into that space. But because I also want to signal, hey, I'm not going to be pinning all this on faith in an Abrahamic God, I'm going to use the word atheist. And so to me, spiritual atheist is the best word sandwich I could come up with for I want to explore our beliefs and our existential fears and rituals and human nature and aspects of our psyche and rites of passage and all these things that religions have been doing. I'm just really not sure what is capital T true or capital R real, and I have a lot of skepticism around the Abrahamic religions. So to signal that to someone else, I'm going to call myself a spiritual atheist, knowing that there's baggage with both terms that make me uncomfortable, but kind of feeling like it's the best I can do.
Yeah, one, that's an incredible skill to have. I wish I could do that. Hopefully, when I'm done with theology school, I can have something like that, but I highly doubt it. Now, of course, we get this idea with, like, Feuerbach wrote about this as well, that we project God, but God, like, we create God, God does not create us. And it seems like that's what you're saying as well. Now, I do want to push back a little bit because this idea that, and make clear, I agree with you. I do think that humans create God concepts. Now, of course, this has no bearing on a particular being or like the God that Aquinas presents in the second way doesn't exist. So in the video that you posted talking about this, you say, why I'm an atheist and not an agnostic. So why choose the word atheist and not the agnostic term when identifying that humans create these God concepts doesn't really disprove or make unlikely that something exists? Rather, the conclusion is something like humans just create God concepts.
Yeah, because you could use like the argument against me that the sheer amount, and Alex O'Connor has said this before, that one of the best arguments for God is that we seem to create so many concepts of it. There's so many arguments for it, right?
Yeah.
And so, so humans doing this projection game could actually be evidence that there seems to be a God pulling us towards it, right? Just in how many guesses we have on what God is. And that's a really fair critique with what I just said. The reason that I'm willing to put a little more skin in the game as far as going towards atheism is that my experience and my job is working with people in that really deep space that we've talked about. And what I've noticed in my experience that makes me tend towards feeling like you can't use the projections that humans make toward evidence of God is that when people get psychological anchors and tools for their existential fears, and they're at peace with death and meaninglessness, and they have a sense of morality that's leading them towards the good life, and they have rituals, and they have just all the tools that you would possibly need for human thriving and dealing with existential fears. They tend to stop psychologically creating God altogether. And watching people go through that process where they will, and it's not like I'm leading them in the sense that I'm trying to destroy their faith. As a spiritual director, it's unethical to lead anyone. So there are hundreds of people that I'm helping just stay in the religion that they're in a more authentic way, because, so just be like, I have to differentiate that this conversation that we're having is much different than a conversation that I would have with a client, which ethically I would not be leading. But as we work with getting people the tools that they need for that deeper space and those existential fears, especially, what I see happen is people just no longer project God at all, because they just have no emotional or psychological need to. And for me, that makes me more willing to put some skin in the game in leaning towards atheism, in saying that not only is this a human project, but when we get the tools that we need, we seem to not have to create this, we seem to not have to play this project with God at all. And that, to me, just is more lending to the idea that we're the ones that create gods out of our psychological, social, and emotional needs, versus this all being evidence that there is a God directing, that pull is because there's God there pulling us. But I could very much be wrong on that, and I really lose nothing being wrong on that one. One of the great things about not having your identity wrapped around certain truth claims is that, like, it's so easy now for me to be wrong, and it's so easy now for me to change my mind and to be free to explore all these ideas, because the way that I live my life is not built on the idea that I'm right about anything. Like, I'm really much more pragmatic, and I think you have some of this pragmatism too, of just how can I live, what philosophers call the good life, without wrapping my identity around truths that I need to be true. And that, to me, has just been such a freeing way of life. So as I'm saying this, like, that's just where my money's at. But I'm very, very open to being wrong on that point, and will be happy to learn that I'm wrong. Like, if I'm wrong and I get to see my children again after I die, I'm ecstatic. I'm not mad that I'm
with
wrong.
you, yeah.
Like, I want people to be right on some of this stuff, because my story about what's right is, like, not great, like not something that I would have chosen. So like, I want to be wrong on this question more than I want to be right, but that's where I'm leaning.
There's a lot there. Now, a word that you used a lot is truth, and I want to get into that a little bit. But do you have another, like, is there something else that, beyond the conception of God that we create them, is there, like, something else you're like, that this just can't be right, like the problem of evil, divine hiddenness? Is there something else you find the most convincing?
Yeah. I think there are some conceptions of God that can really do okay with the problem of evil, in not making God culpable for it. Open and relational theology is one of the best that I've seen in how they deal with theodicy, the problem of evil. But for me, I find it highly problematic in the level that violence is baked into the nature of existence, that what is behind that is a good God. Could there be a creator of some form, or some ground of being, or an alien that's just, like, sprinkling life and like, all of that is like, because we know so little about how life began and the universe and what the hell even consciousness is, all of that is completely open to me. Where you're going to get my highest skepticism is definitely when you start to smuggle in "and God is good," because the nature of suffering baked into evolution. I just can't see that the God, for example, that gave us the Sermon on the Mount, where the weak and vulnerable are really highlighted, that's the same God that chose as his tool of life evolution, where the weak are the ones who are violently eaten while alive. You know what I mean? And for millions of years before humans are even here. There's no way I can make sense of that, where behind that most obvious, answer to that is good God.
Hmm.
So some of that is just my experience in working with people in existential fears and seeing how people project God and seeing that change as they get more tools. And then you're right, like a big portion of that is going to be the problem with suffering. Religion can do a lot to do with human suffering to make some of that necessary. But I think when it comes to animal suffering, there's just no good arguments to say a
Hmm.
good God is behind this. And this is like the most ethical way that this project of life could have played out. I just don't. The violence of animals baked into the system of reality is something that deeply, deeply troubles me.
Yeah, I'm certainly there with you. There's another thing about the problem of evil that I've been kind of thinking a lot about recently, is that there could be a reason that God permitted evil, right? I think we can both agree on that. My issue is there's evil, but also I think that if God were all good, all loving in this aspect, then God would at least make it appear as though there is a justification. But if we look out into the world, we don't really get
Mm,
that. Now, a Christian might
mm,
say, well, of course, Jesus came and he told us, right? And we have the scriptures. But of course, scriptures are incredibly unreliable, not written by eyewitnesses and written decades after the
mhm,
Jesus' resurrection. Um, and it might have seemed the resurrection, if it occurred, would seem like good evidence for the apostles. It would not
mm,
be seen as good evidence for people 2,000 years later after the Kantian revolution, where we don't even know about the external world anymore. Right? I think that we would have
mm.
good evidence
Yeah.
for us today.
Or I think a bigger problem is the 300,000 years of human history before Jesus, right?
Yeah,
Where we're
yeah,
just
yeah.
like, you know what I mean? Like we're just living and dying, creating gods, religions that are dead now. Like, what was the
Mhm.
point of all of their I wish sometimes Christians could just like step out of their experience to just imagine like what was it like to be a human 50,000 years ago, and you just wake up and the person next to you just drop dead for mysterious
Yeah.
reasons because you don't know about germs, and then like all of a sudden there's an eclipse and there's an earthquake, and like that must have been absolutely terrifying.
Hmm.
Like of course we did a lot of superstitious rituals to try to keep the gods happy. Like that must have been so much suffering and confusion, and then
Yeah.
like all of that for like at least tens of thousands of years, if not hundreds of thousands of years before we're even going to tell humans what the point of this is. Like that's
Hmm.
cruel. That's so
Yeah.
cruel to me. That was such like a I think it's one of the reasons why Christianity or some forms of Christianity will hold on to young earth theory, is because I think seeing humans for thousands of years suffer and struggle and not knowing why is difficult, and it's going to make a lot more sense if you just cut it down to 6,000.
Yeah. 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 I never even thought about it that way. That's really interesting. Um, yeah, I mean, I think that especially like you alluded to the animal suffering. Let's say that humans popped up only a couple thousand years ago. We do have tons of animal suffering that within all of these theodicies seemingly do not account for animal suffering. As for soul making, for example, I don't think that an animal is going to be learning
Mm,
anything to become a
yeah.
better deer
What was the
if they
moral?
are
Yeah, what was
injured.
the moral lesson there?
Yeah, it just seems incredibly unlikely. So, but now that we looked at all this, looked at atheism, nihilism, and you and I both think that they are true, is there value in seeing them as true?
Um, yeah, it's hard to say because they can become their own traps, because the like our identity and our ego is so sneaky in that way, where like it's like the teenager who says who rebels and starts just doing whatever the parent like makes the parents mad and saying like, oh, I'm rebelling and I'm free, and it's like, no, your identity is still kind of like wrapped around the thing.
Hmm.
And so sometimes I see with nihilists and atheists, and maybe I play into this certainly too, and there may be still sometimes that I do, where like it becomes your new identity, and it becomes your new truth system. It becomes your new way to do in and out groups in your social life. It becomes your new way to feel like you're better than other people because you're smarter than them, the same way you thought you're smarter than everyone when you were a Christian. And so I do think it's a problem to treat atheism and nihilism as isms of truth. I see it much more helpful as just places of negation rather than places that are just claiming truth. So I wouldn't say that atheism is making a positive claim on the universe. I wouldn't say even nihilism is making a positive claim about the nature of reality. I tend to think that these work better when they're just more negations against more fundamentalist forms of truth claims that seem to be problematic in our world. And I think that if you start to orient around either atheism or nihilism as capital T truth, then your identity starts to wrap around it in ways where like you essentially make a religion out of it. And that I think I do see sometimes, and that tends to be more of a human nature thing that happens more than something discussed in philosophy. That I think that's much more of a psychological thing happening.
Yeah.
So for me, atheism and nihilism are not these capital T truths that I'm trying to convert everyone else to. It's just these places of negation that allows for further explorations of what possibly could be, what is. So I'm still just very interested in the question of God and reality and morality and ethics and all these things. And atheism and nihilism just kind of give me a place to explore without getting too dogmatic. But I don't want to wrap around it and talk about it as if they are worldviews of truth. Then you start wrapping your ego around that.
Yeah. So the new atheism movement was very much truth for truth. And Nietzsche, way
Right.
before this,
Yeah.
was very much just like, what the hell do you mean by truth? You
Yeah.
know, why do we even value this?
Right.
So what we still see today in this influence from the new atheism movement is people who try to dismantle religious ideas for the sake of truth. And they
Okay.
may attack your approach of adopting religious ideas and using them as a secular type of
Yeah.
approach to the human condition. So
Yeah.
when you look at that, what would you respond to people who take that approach?
Yeah. Oh, it's such a good question. So I do think that new atheism truth is good, and it's going to lead us towards this secular utopia. It does seem that idea kind of failed to deliver, and there's lots of atheists who are talking about that idea seems to be dying, because I think what happens, and Joe Foley talks about this a lot. Foley, how do you say his last
I
name?
don't even know anymore.
whatever his name is, who does a lot of philosophical content on YouTube. He said the thing that keeps him up at night is that, yes, everybody kind of uses circular reasoning when they talk about how they get their rationality from, but when you use God, it's like a self-reinforcing circular reasoning. Whereas when you start to dip into nihilism and atheism, you start to realize that, one, you can't even trust your rationality, because why should we if we're evolutionary creatures and evolution doesn't evolve us for truth, it evolves us for evolutionary fitness. So how do you have any grounding to trust your rationality when you're doing this high horse thing that, like, yeah, we're leaving religion because it's not true? And I think that the Christian apologists who talk about this, like, I think a lot of them are right on this, and that atheists need to be honest about it. That there's a lack of grounding there for what we're calling rationality. But there's also something in there too that I think you've talked about on your channel, that why are we claiming that truth is good and that truth is going to lead us to secular utopia? Because we're starting to find evidence to the opposite. There is an inverse relationship between how much philosophy you read and how happy you are. Like, it can tend towards depression. Like, we have some evidence that shows, like scientific evidence, like if you're a scientific driven person, the science is stronger on the side that some amount of ignorance is bliss. Like, maybe you'll actually be happier if there really is no free will. You may actually be happier not knowing that. And you
Mhm.
actually may even live a more moral life not knowing that too. Daniel Dennett talked about the possibility of that. So we have two problems here. Like, one is we're trying to play this truth game, out here critiquing religion, not knowing not being able to trust our reasoning at all, because why would we? And then also we have to really think to ourselves about, like, why is truth good when there's some truths that seem to be maladaptive to human thriving? That is a
Mhm.
huge problem. And this is the problem that I get from serious thinking atheists. I think the atheists who are more there because it's like really fun to be the Christopher Hitchens in your friend group and beat up religious people. I think
Mhm.
that there's just like a naivety to that. Like, you haven't thought about this long enough and been in this space long enough to realize that there's some significant critique from the Christian apologists who will combat atheism and say this about atheism. And I think it's a real problem. I think it's a real
Mhm.
problem, where then the problem becomes, for this space, do we matter truth or well-being? And the hard thing, this is so hard for religious people, because I'll tell you why. Because if you get to this space, you go from religion to atheism to nihilism, you start to go down some of these rabbit holes, and you get to a space where you say, you know what, actually, well-being has to matter more than truth. And now we need to do these kind of lowercase truths that are helpful. And then, why the hell then did you leave Mormonism?
Mhm.
Because it's just these things that aren't true but are probably helpful. Like, there's a lot of things in Mormonism that it's going to lead you to longer longevity, that has such a strong community, that's good for you, it gives you meaning and purpose and all these things. And so you realize, some people realize, like, at the end of their religious deconstruction that was all about truth, that they end up in this place where well-being matters more than truth. And then they're like, oh, maybe I didn't have as high of a high ground leaving my religion because it wasn't true than I thought I did. Now, that doesn't mean that they just go back to religion. That tends to be like once you kind of open that door, you can't really fully go back. But it does make people more open to playing in religious and spiritual spaces, and being a little bit
Mhm.
more flexible with this truth word than the day that they left religion, when they're like, it's not true, therefore it's not good, and I'm not going to be a part of it. And
Mhm.
that's like a long circle that I see a lot of people go through.
Yeah, I'm really glad that you pointed that out, because the limits of epistemology are absolutely a problem for the atheist. There is no question.
Absolutely. Like, I'll
We
give
evolve.
yeah, yeah, yeah.
Yeah,
Go ahead, Stan.
we evolved to find to survive. You're right. We did not evolve to have universal truth. Now, to defend the atheist a little bit, we evolved to have some truth about our internal function, so how I feel, and methods for survival. So, like, I can know that it's true that a lion's running at me, right? So I could probably evolve to trust, like, my local surroundings and kind of know what's going on around me. But this does not give me uh, universal truth making tools to then learn, the truth in hard philosophical positions. I'm there 100%. Now, what does rationality then mean? This is why I've been so interested in, like, the world making stuff. Of We can know stuff because we created the world that we're living in. Like, we created, like, these systems of the worlds of art and dance and even the language of science. Like, we can know these things because we're the creators of them. Like, we're in this world, but what we know is not of the world, it's of the world that we made. So I think that the atheist could then be in a much better position to defend themselves against the claim that um of the you can't, like, your epistemology isn't grounded. And I would just say, yeah, but I'm in a pretty good position to kind of know what's going on around me. And
Yeah.
they would say, well, like, but you're not resting on anything. And I'd go, yeah, you're not either. You just think you are from your frame of
Yeah.
reference. Yeah.
Yeah,
What are your thoughts there?
100%. Like, 100%. Like, even some of the phrases that you've used are things that I've said. So I'm the same way for both rationality and moral grounding. So when the Christian apologist says your rationality isn't grounded, I 100% give them that chess move. You can have that chess move all day.
Hmm.
It's a problem. And I'll do the same even for moral grounding. Your morality has no ultimate grounding. Like, if you want to make that chess move, I'll give it to them all day long. But I still think I'm in a better position. That, like, okay,
Hmm.
let's say that there is objective morality, we just don't know what it is, so we're all using subjective morality anyway. And how you're reading the Bible and highlighting some passages and aggressively negotiating others is subjective
Hmm.
morality. So even if my morality is like, I admit that it's not grounded, if I have a conversation and secular values and the science of well-being and empathy on my side of the table, even with no moral grounding, I'm going to get further in a moral system or as a moral person than you trying to ground this in the Bible. So I'm still in the
Hmm.
better position, even if I give you that chess move. And the same for
Yeah.
rationality. Like, yeah, it's not grounded. It
Hmm.
really could be like that all of this is just based into preferences because of evolution and all of that. Even so, I still think I'm in a better position having all these tools at bay or at my disposal than you trying to ground rationality into because God says so or because God gave it to
Hmm.
me. I'm still in a better position. So yeah,
Yeah.
that move I allow them to have, but I don't think it takes you automatically back to their God.
I think it's so interesting because I think that there's a bit of Tartaglia that can be used here to say that, like,
Mm,
you and I are still using this religious language. Like, yeah, it's a problem, but why is it a problem? Like, if we really take a step
mm,
back from the framework, like, where does this idea of this being a problem come from? It
mm.
might just be because we're in a society that views it as a problem. If we were in a
Yeah,
different
and I
society from
would
a
go,
different frame of reference.
yeah, yeah. And I still have evidence that says like the religion is just the image of what we actually need psychologically. Because I'm
Hmm.
working in the deep psychological space with people, I see that they're not just reaching for rational grounding or moral grounding because the religion trained them to. It's also because it gives us existential insecurity to feel
Hmm.
like what we're doing is not grounded in an ultimate reality. It gives us a
Hmm.
sense of psychological insecurity, which raises just our levels of anxiety in the brain. And so I
Hmm.
think that there's a psychological thing happening underneath the religion that's creating the religion to do that, that he's not fully validating there.
Hmm.
But that's
Yeah, and
but that could be my bias because that's the space that I'm hanging out.
Mhm. No, I agree, and I think there's something to be said to the Christian, particularly conservatives, who would kind of argue against us. There is that, facts don't care about your feelings. These
Yeah.
things can be true, even though you don't like them. And I think that this goes
Yeah.
both ways for the morality and for the epistemology. So I actually I think that you're right that there's a problem here. I just don't think that it's as much of a problem as people tend to make it seem.
Right. Because when they
Yeah.
make that chess move, they feel like it's a checkmate. And it's like,
Hmm.
no, I'll give you that chess move. I'm still in a better position here. I'm still gonna, even if I
Yeah.
grant that, I'm still gonna win this debate with what I've
Yeah.
got going on my side here. So yeah, I agree with you on that one. But yeah, I disagree with this idea that it's just because of religious conditioning that's giving us that idea, because I really wrestle with people in their deepest existential angst in what they're seeking in order to feel psychologically okay to be able to function.
Hmm.
And that's similar to like terror management theory, where like you don't realize how much your brain is doing to avoid looking at death. You actually have
Hmm.
no idea subconsciously how much it's working, and things that you wouldn't even think of. Like we'll remind people of death, and lawyers will be more strict in their sentencing, for example, because they will feel like they are a part of the law that outlives them. It gives them a symbolic
Mm.
resurrection in a way. If I remind you of death and you go into a church of Christians and Jews, you will sit with your group rather than sit closer to the other group. If I don't remind you of that, you just kind of sit anywhere. But you'll sit next to
Mm.
your group if you're reminded of death. You may go shopping more at the end of the day and not realize that you're doing it or not know why. And so when I'm working in the space of like really getting in there to the nuts and bolts, I'm not seeing that this is just in religious indoctrination. I'm seeing a brain that has existential anxieties that make it hard for it to function in this world, but it's looking for anchoring in, rational anchoring, moral anchoring, not
Mhm.
dying, things like that to function. And that's what I see as the true driver underneath, the religion rather than the religion itself.
Yeah, we can talk about so much for so long. We're running a little bit out of time.
Yeah.
What would you want people to take from the episode, from your work, from what you do on social media? What do you want them to try to understand, maybe about themselves, about the world, about spirituality, religion, atheism, nihilism, anything like that?
Yeah, that's a good question because I'm speaking to a lot of different audiences here, and they're getting different things from me. But really, the gooey space that I'm trying to point people to is that, like, there's this atheistic space that's very rational and very skeptical, and we need those tools at the table. But if you just have that, like, I know a lot of atheists who, like, yeah, they're rational and they're not religious, but like they're not thriving either. Like there's some limitations there. And then there's like there's religious space, and there's a lot of good stuff in there. There's really interesting and really helpful tools in there. We co-evolved with religion for a reason. It's not just bullshit. And yet there's a lot of bullshit, right? And then there's this new age space which has like really cool occult tools, which is fantastic for working with aspects of your psyche and archetype and this conversation between your conscious and subconscious mind. And then there's just also a lot of bullshit and manifesting and energy frequency stuff that is just like pseudoscientific at best, and Deepak Chopra nonsense. And I'm glad that he's, getting, not that I'm glad that he's in the Epstein files, but like I'm glad that people are seeing that he's such a grifter, because he is. But if you can take the tools of each space, if you can keep your skepticism on board and explore the tools of religion and spirituality, and explore the tools of philosophy, and even some of these occult, these new age spaces, there's a lot of tools here that just make life better, just make life better at the level of experience, that make you able to withstand suffering better, that make you that moved me personally from a place of suicidal nihilism to a place where like nihilism isn't really a problem, and I feel like I'm thriving in life. I'll be ready to let it go when it's time to let it go, but I can still at this point say I'm glad that I got to pop my head out in the universe and experience anything at all. And there were times in my life where I didn't feel like that. And so if I can just point people that if we can bring all of those tools into a space that's more open to religion and spirituality and philosophy too, there's a lot of existentialism, especially that I use with clients. If we can bring that into a space but still call out, the bullshit in these spaces, I think that's when you get the best of both worlds. And I see people who are really positively affected by that and can even move from suicidality towards thriving. And that's really what I want to do with my work.
That's awesome. Yeah, I definitely agree with, I think, everything that you've said. Well, it's always such a good time to have a conversation. And like I said, we could go back and forth.
I know, we could do this all day.
Hours.
This is so fun. I know, it's so fun.
But it was really, really nice to talk with you, and really grateful that you came on the show.
Yeah, my pleasure, Austin. I saw you pretty early on. I told you off air that I saw you pretty early on when you were starting to make content, and I knew right away that I'm going to be really excited to watch your journey in this space, because I think you have a lot to offer and that you're really bright, and I can't wait to see what you do as you continue to explore these ideas.
Thank you. I really deeply appreciate it. And like I said, you were like one of the first people who reached out to me at the very beginning. And I was like, oh my God.
I was like, you don't know it yet, but you've got it. Like you've got something. And it's going to be great.
Thank you. I'm sure that we'll have some more conversations going. And hopefully I really want to do something down the line of like a kind of like a panel thing. In person at some point, where I want to get so many different people together and just really start to hash stuff out. It's something I've been working on recently.
Literally just thinking, like when you were talking about we could do this all day, it's like, this is like what we would do at a dinner party. Like what we just recorded would be exactly what we would do at a dinner party. And it's like, I'll have on air or off air, I'll dinner party with you anytime. That'll be great.
Yeah. Well, it's really nice to have you on the show.
All right.